On the 15th of August 1945, Australian Prime Minister Ben Chifley announced to a weary nation that the Allies had won victory in the Pacific, and that after 6 long years of struggle, World War II was finally over. Japan had surrendered.
Fellow citizens, the war is over. The Japanese government has accepted the terms of surrender imposed by the Allied nations, and hostilities will now cease. The reply by the Japanese government to the note sent by Britain, the United Nations, the USSR and China has been received and accepted by the Allied nations. At this moment, let us offer thanks to God. Let us remember those whose lives were given that we may enjoy this glorious moment and may look forward to a peace which they have won for us.
It was around 9 a.m. and cities around Australia spontaneously erupted into celebrations. Crowds filled the streets of Sydney, and Martin Place in particular became awash with torn paper, streamers, and even toilet rolls flung from the open windows of city buildings. Church bells rang, and ferries and ships sounded their horns for hours, as people hugged, laughed, and danced in the streets. Here's how an ABC reporter described the scene.
Hello everyone, this is Talbot Duck Madden speaking to you from Martin Place, Sydney. But I'm afraid that today, it's not the old Martin Place that you know so well. There's no bus outside the Airways office here. There's no constable on duty at Pitt Street directing the traffic. There are no office boys posting mail at the letterboxes. Instead, there are thousands and thousands of people. Honestly, I've never seen so many people in Martin Place before. They're packed tight from above Castlereagh Street, all the way down across Pitt Street, past the Cenotaph, and way down here to the George Street end of Martin Place, where we have the mobile studio park. There are men, women, and girls, lovely girls too, hundreds and hundreds of them. They've got paper hats on their heads, waving streamers, flags, Union Jacks, the Stars and Stripes. They've got whistles, those gas alarm rattlers, and they're just having one whale of a time. It's about an hour since the official news came through, and of course most of these young people were on their way to the offices, and so they've just stayed in town. I heard somebody down below say they stayed in just for the fun of it, and there's certainly plenty of fun here in this heart of Sydney this morning. Over on my right, in one of the buildings at the back, somebody has hung out a big dummy of Adolf Hitler.
For those fighting in the Pacific, the news came as a relief, including Corporal David Trist, who, as part of the 58th 59th Battalion, had been fighting the Japanese on the island of Bougainville since 1944. David enlisted in the AIF at the age of 18 in 1943, in the desperate days of the defence of Australia against the Japanese Imperial Army, the Japs, as they were called then. But it wasn't the first time someone in his family had defended his country. He was following in the footsteps of both his father and father-in-law, who had both enlisted in the First World War. His future father-in-law, John Cobcroft, enlisted in 1916 from his job in Samoa. John was accepted into Duntroon Military College in Canberra, from which he graduated the following year. There, John learned about trench warfare and kept an immaculately detailed and illustrated exercise book of notes of his courses at Duntroon, seen here for the very first time. His book includes detailed drawings of different types of grenades.
So, David, we've been looking at John Cobcroft's notes from his training in Duntroon. Can you tell us a bit about grenades and your experience with grenades?
John Cobcroft went to Duntroon Officers Training School 1916, he kept a rather nice exercise book, including a lot of illustrations of explosives and grenades and mortar shells and that sort of thing. But in World War One, the same design of hand grenade, a Mills bomb, as they were called, he's got photos or illustrations of those. Mills bombs were used by the infantry, Australian infantry. Usually had 3 or 4 in your gear. You'd hook them onto your belt, for example, and they'd be carried quite safely until a pin was pulled out. And when the pin was pulled out, a lever flew off and the grenade became active. You had, in some cases, 5 seconds to release the grenade, in some cases 7 seconds. And if you wanted it to burst in the air over the enemy, you'd use the 5-second one, count 1, 2 and throw on 3, and then by the time it reached your target, it would probably explode in air and it was more effective that way. The 7-second one you'd use with a rifle grenade, where some fellows in the section would have an attachment to put on the top of their rifle. You'd pull the pin out and gently lower the grenade into this cup-like thing on top of your rifle. And you had you didn't fire your normal bullets, there was a special bullet that just sent gas out, and it would shoot the grenade up in the air and it'd probably go 150 yards. Right. And they were quite effective. And the Japanese had a lot of those too, by the way. And then with the Japanese grenades in Bougainville, where I had a bit of experience of them, they'd become a bit ineffective. And to boost their explosive power, the Japs used to strap on the outside of their grenade a picric acid block, a yellow acid soaked in cotton wool, and they'd strap it on the side of the grenade. And when the grenade went off, the picric acid would also burst and send out a great plume of yellow gas. But it added to the strength of their grenade.
Did you have one time where in a previous conversation, told me that you pulled the pin on the grenade and started to do the counting, and you didn't want to throw it, and you were trying to put trying to find the pin? That
in the dark one night, I had dug a slit trench and put 4 grenades in a little hollow about waist high in the slit trench, in the wall of the slit trench, being attacked, and threw the first 3 grenades, and the 4th one started to throw it, still holding it in my hand. I pulled the pin out and dropped it, and there was nothing to throw. The Japs had left by that stage, so I thought, I better not throw this one, and I couldn't find the pin. So I held the grenade for what seemed like an hour or 2, but probably only half an hour. Right. And then lay this, and I threw it. And of course that started off the alarm system again in the section, the company where I was in the jungle. And probably made everybody very nervous that we were about to be attacked again. But that night, the Japs had crept up, and they'd dropped some grenades or thrown some grenades around the little sleeping bay my mate and I had behind the trench, and woke us all up. And next morning, when the light came, the Sergeant Major crept up and asked, we had to go out with him out the front. But as he looked in our sleeping bay, he said, "You blokes were lucky, there's 2 Japanese unexploded grenades in there that they'd thrown in and hadn't gone off while we were asleep." So,
and had they gone off, you wouldn't be here?
Oh, we wouldn't be here, no, because it was in a confined area where 2 of us were sleeping on some banana leaves.
So do you think that during the war there was a deal of luck?
There was.
Bad luck?
I was thinking about that today, and I think I was asked, why did I join the army? Well, I joined it because Australia was being attacked, and it was a very difficult time. But I made a vow to myself that I would kill more of them than they killed of me. So they only had one to kill.
Right.
And I felt that if every soldier went in to kill more of them than they get of you. So I succeeded. They didn't kill me and I killed a few of them.
Mm-hmm.
You shouldn't scot about those sort of things, but at the time, that was the job.
That's right, that's right.
John Cobcroft graduated from Duntroon as a second lieutenant in 1917, and he sailed on the troopship HMT Euripides to England via the Panama Canal. After arriving in England, John served on the Western Front in France. While David's father-in-law saw action, his own father Ernest arrived too late. Ernest Trist enlisted in the AIF in December 1917. He trained for several months and was then promoted to corporal and sailed on a ship to the Middle East. But by the time he arrived, the war, thankfully, had ended. Ernest's son David enlisted in the AIF in 1943.
There were really two enlistments. One was an unofficial enlistment when I was 16 at Queanbeyan in the Volunteer Defence Corps, the VDC, where we were weekend warriors guarding places around the ACT and in particular, Harmon Wireless Station and the War Memorial, which had just been built. And we used to guard those and parade and learn a lot of infantry work and also commando type knowledge, how to disguise yourself out in the open ground and how to move at night time through areas, keep to the ridges in the daylight and to the gullies at night time so that you weren't silhouetted. So I had all that knowledge for almost 2 years in the Volunteer Defence Corps, and then when I was 18, because the job I was in was called a reserved occupation, I had to get permission from my employer to join up, so I got that. And then when I was 18, just after I was 18, the local Shire clerk, who was the recruiting officer for Queanbeyan, he sent me a message to come in, you're about to join the army. So I went down to his office, he equipped me with a train ticket to Goulburn, and I packed my gear up from the boarding house where I was. That went into storage eventually, and I don't think I ever got it back. I don't remember getting that stuff back. But went to Goulburn, final recruitment, then to the Sydney Pig Pavilion at the showground, given a Hessian bag which I filled with straw, and that was called a palliasse. You slept on that nice mattress, if you're lucky. I don't think I had any blankets. But and then the medical tests, and then on a train with about 40 or 50 other young soldiers to Cowra, where we lined up, and I was asked, the Sergeant Major yelled out, anybody with previous military experience step forward. There might have been 50 of us. A couple of young fellows stepped forward, and the Sergeant Major came in, where were you? I was over in Tobruk. I joined when I was 15. And then they found out my age and I got discharged, but I thought I'd join up again. Because when they came to me, they thought I was having a joke with them. I said I'd had nearly 2 years in the VDC. But they ended up deciding that I didn't need the preliminary training, and that expedited my preliminary training from Cowra and Dubbo, where I served for a few weeks, down to the young soldier unit, the 18th Battalion at French's Forest. The young soldiers weren't allowed to go overseas until they were 19. So I went, after doing a fair bit of work, being used as wharf labourers, and also to go out and help with the Japanese POW breakout at Cowra. We headed off to Canungra, which was the jungle training school.
Yes. What do you think in the VDC helped you prepare for fighting in the jungles of Bougainville later on?
Well, any training is good training, but I thought the training in hand grenades, it's very easy to get frightened if you've got a deathly thing in your hand and you don't know much about it. But the live experience of throwing hand grenades, and I was quite a good cricketer, I thought, and it was just like bowling a fast ball, and you belted it out and dropped down behind into a trench after you threw it.
A good thrower.
Yeah.
Oh.
And of course, I was also an experienced shot with a rifle. Most kids those days had a .22 rifle, and we used to go out hunting rabbits and sell the skins.
Yep.
But when I joined the army, they gave us we sent us out to the rifle range, and I did what I thought was quite well. So I had in my paybook marked that I was a marksman. I got quite a good score, and they paid me 6pence a day extra.
Oh, wow.
Instead of 6 shillings, I got 6 and 6pence.
Right. Now
which is the equivalent of 65 cents.
Right. Today.
A day.
You mentioned you went to Cowra. You awoke next morning. You travelled overnight to Cowra to discover that there'd been an outbreak by the Japanese prisoners there in the PW camp.
Yeah.
Tell us about that experience.
Yes, well, we were put on the train at Central, about 6 or 7 of us, and went through the night. We got to Cowra about dawn, and there were signs of the outbreak of dead Japanese. A lot of them were on the railway line where they'd committed suicide, let the train run over. Oh. And there were 200 odd Japanese killed, and they killed a couple of the Australian guards. So it took 3 or 4 days to round the escaped Japanese up, and our job, the 6 or 7 of us from the 18th Battalion, was to escort the trucks from Cowra POW camp to the Hay POW camp. And that line, there were probably 300 or 400 Japanese recaptured, bunged in these flat-top trucks, and they had wire cages built so they couldn't jump out. And we, the 18th Battalion boys, were in the front seat, but we stood up and put our head through a hole in the top of the cabin roof with a gun, and hoped that the Japanese didn't break out. Because I don't think they gave us any ammunition. That's probably the way the army works sometimes.
Guns without any ammunition.
I'm not sure about that. But anyhow, there were no sealed roads from between Cowra and Hay, and with maybe 20 or 30 vehicles, jeeps and these trucks, there was this huge column of dust going back miles. Ooh. And if you were in one of the back trucks, which fortunately I wasn't, there's everybody had handkerchiefs tied over their face. We got to Hay Camp, and the guards were from the VDC, the Volunteer First World War blokes, who were doing the guard there. An interpreter told the Japanese, who were a little bit querulous, when they were put inside the wire in the PW camp, that if any of them crossed this white line encircling just inside the barbed wire in the camp, that they'd get shot. And of course, we were overlooking the camp. There was a sergeant's mess. We were given a drink of beer up, and we could look over the camp. The old fellas had taken over at that stage, but we knew what was going on. And the Japanese gathered in groups, and they'd rush at this white line and then stop until one of them was pushed over, and he got shot. I don't know whether he's killed or not, I don't know, but so that quietened them down a bit.
How long were you in Hay, or did you stay in Cowra?
Oh, that was only probably one day. I think the next morning we were bussed out or got on the train. I forget how we got back to Sydney, probably on the train.
Right. Then you were sent to Queensland to be trained in jungle warfare.
Yeah, it was a very wonderful training camp, Canungra. By that stage, the Australians had become well-trained jungle fighters. The Japanese, when they came down, also were very well-trained jungle fighters. And it was about a 6-week course, and you got very little food. In fact, the groups, if you're in C Company in Canungra, for example, for breakfast, you didn't have breakfast at C Company. You had to line up and run maybe 4 miles to another unit at 6 o'clock in the morning with your Dixie to be fed. In other words, that's the PE training.
Oh, right.
And for washing, there were no showers or anything. There's a creek. You had to go down to the creek and learn how to have a shave and wash yourself in jungle conditions.
Yes. So how long were you training there?
Well, I think 4 to 6 weeks. And I remember we went to Brisbane at the end of it, and we were all pretty fit, and Jimmy Sharman's boxing tent was, we were given leave and we moved into Brisbane, and a few of the boys hopped in and had a fight at Jimmy Sharman's boxing tent.
Oh, right.
Just to stay fit and willing to go at that stage.
Then you were assembled with hundreds of thousands of troops. From Brisbane you went up to Cairns.
Yes, up on the Atherton Tablelands. As the battalions were given a rest from New Guinea, they used to ship them back to the Atherton Tablelands. And there were, obviously quite a lot of troops waiting to go back to New Guinea all the time. And our mob were going as reinforcements for the decimated battalions who'd lost, killed and wounded and needed reinforcements to fill them up. And of course, some of these young blokes went to the 9th Division, some to the 7th Division, 6th Division, and I went to the 3rd Division, to the 58th, 59th Battalion.
Right.
Hundreds of thousands of troops were assembled at Cairns, awaiting transport as reinforcements to Papua New Guinea. In early 1942, the Japanese had invaded New Britain, New Guinea and Bougainville, and headed then southward down the chain of Solomon Islands to Guadalcanal. The Bougainville campaign became one of the final campaigns of the war in the Pacific. It's a largely overlooked theatre of war, overshadowed by the wartime coverage regarding the famous Kokoda Track campaign. From 1942 onward, American ground forces took on an increasing role, assisting Australian, New Zealand and Fijian forces in the Southwest Pacific area. In November 1944, the US 3rd Division took over the fight on Bougainville, relieving 2 divisions of American troops as part of Supreme Allied Commander Douglas MacArthur's island-hopping campaign northward toward the Philippines and Japan itself. David still has his army uniform and memorabilia such as wartime maps and photographs. This famous photo, always attributed to the Kokoda Track, was actually taken in Salamoa. Five Australian brigades took over the American base at Torokina, and David was based there in the 58th 59th Battalion.
At Salamoa, which is north of Kokoda, and through these very high mountains in Papua and New Guinea, the tracks were called, one instance Kokoda, and the other instance the Commiatum track. Our battalion was involved with the Commiatum track, going over what was called Double Mountain and then down to Salamoa. And around about July 1943, in action, one of our soldiers, Woe Johnson, was wounded in the head, and the sergeant stretcher bearer, Gordon Ayres, escorted him back, had his arm around him, and they were crossing a creek when the official war photographer, Damien Parra, took their picture. And you often see in Anzac days this picture because it showed this relatively small Sergeant Gordonairs and the big tall Woe Johnson with bandages across his eyes being escorted. Woe did recover from that. He was back at the battalion about 3 or 4 weeks later, and then would you believe he got blown up again? And that time it was seriously, he had to go back to Australia and we didn't see him again. Torquay, we were given the go in November 44. A troop ship came into Cairns and we packed up all of our gear and went down and got on this troop ship, which was a Dutch ship. And we didn't know where we were going, but we were eventually told. And then for the next 2 or 3 days, we sailed from Cairns across to Torquay, where the Americans were moving out and we were to take their position in this area that they'd been holding for about 12 months. There was no wharf, so we had to clamber down the side of this big vessel on rope ladders, which with a big pack on your back was pretty difficult, and get into a landing craft under the rope ladder and then into Torquay and land on the beach. So we then took over from they had 2 divisions there and we had far less troops to fill their spot. But they were a bit lousy. They were living the life of luxury, as the Yanks were prone to do. And they had these canteens, or PXs as they called them. And instead of leaving all the lollies and ice cream and soft drinks, they buried it. They wouldn't leave it for us, and we were very cranky with them. But a few days after they'd left, I located where they'd buried something, and I dug it up, and it was Coca-Cola. The first time I ever drank Coca-Cola, I dug it up from about 4 feet under a pile of sand.
Right. Did it taste
well, I don't think I liked it very much, actually. It probably wouldn't be very cold for a start.
No,
but I can still remember that first taste of Coca-Cola from where the Yankee owner had buried it.
From there you moved up to Salamoa, did you?
No, Salamoa occurred before. Salamoa was in 43,
right.
44,
right.
And then
so where did you
Bougainville was my first action,
right.
and we were there for about 12 months, some of which we weren't in action. But the war finished, and our battalion was down the front of South Bougainville, where most of the fighting occurred.
Right.
And it was really, how do you move through a swamp all the time? There's very wet conditions and a lot of skin diseases, because you'd go to sleep in wet clothes, you didn't take your boots off for 2 or 3 days, and your feet would be covered with skin diseases.
And you wouldn't have a change of gear?
No.
For how long?
Oh, you're given time off where possible to do your washing, and you'd either jump in the creek and wash your clothes while if there weren't any crocodiles there, which there were a few around that, and try and wash your clothes.
Right.
But when if I can jump to when I came back to Australia in June, July 1946, the first thing I did was to go to a barber, David Jones Barber in Market Street, and I still remember telling the bloke, "What do you want?" I said, "I want you to wash my hair." Right. And the first time, and probably the only time I've ever had a professional hair wash. Right. And I hadn't washed it for maybe 12 months.
But that felt good.
Yeah, fantastic.
So you mentioned your first time of combat. How did you feel and what were your thoughts?
Well, I was a pretty brash young bloke, and I think I was always fairly calm, cool and collected. Most of our blokes were, and you just faced up to what was in front of you.
So you felt fairly confident?
Yeah.
But particularly because of the training you'd had?
Well, probably that was part of it.
And you'd had 2 years?
Yeah, and I had a relatively long training period.
Yes.
And the main thing you had to fight was being tired and wet and miserable.
Yeah. So you would have long. You wouldn't have gotten much sleep, I'd imagine.
Well, you know, if you're in an active area and you're on picket duty, as we used to call it, 2 hours on and 4 hours off, and in that 4 hours, there was shelling going on and you didn't get much sleep.
Yeah.
But at least you're lying down. But then when it's time to go back on duty, picket duty, you slipped out and got in your slit trench, and you had to stand there watching out front and side for 2 hours.
Yes, yeah.
And I always tended to go to sleep. I was so tired, yeah. And
surprisingly.
And that's probably, you know, the Japs could sneak up and they'd slip inside your position and create havoc if somebody had gone to sleep. But we did set out to stop that happening. We had booby traps. You'd have a bully beef tin, and you'd take the pin off a hand grenade, slip it in so that the arm didn't fly off,
Right.
and then string it between a bit of string, so that when somebody tripped over this tripwire, the grenade would be popped out of the tin, and goodbye Japanese.
Right.
But that used to be a better way of keeping them under control than some blokes asleep on duty in a slit trench.
Yes. Now you were put into the I section at one stage.
Yes.
What was
the I section, the intelligence section, we weren't necessarily intelligent, but we were taught how to use a compass in the jungle. And maps were around. We were provided with maps of the jungle, and the route of a patrol might go out 1,000 yards that way, 1,000 on such a bearing, and so on until you got back to your camp. And that would sometimes take all day to do a patrol like that. And so to stick to that bearing, compass bearing, you had to, and go the distance, you had to remember to count how many paces you had. And if you came to an obstruction, such as a fallen tree, and you were on a bearing, then you had to walk around the tree and hopefully come back to the bearing that you're on before, and then remember how many yards you'd walked, and hopefully know you didn't run into a Jap patrol while you're trying to remember how many yards you'd gone on that bearing. But also, if you're walking down a track, the I section bloke was still guiding the patrol, usually as a second scout up the front. And we learnt how to map read. The maps were prepared from aerial photographs and converted into maps. And they tried to put land contours so you know whether you're going up and down the hills, and map in Japanese positions. Little drop of red on the map meant there was a weapon pit of the enemy, and hopefully you wouldn't walk straight into it.
Your battalion did very well. I heard that they never lost a battle.
That's correct. There's records of the 58th, 59th and the other two battalions in our brigade. They all went in more or less half-trained and very poorly armed in the early stages of the war into New Guinea, as most of the militia battalions did.
So tell us about the battle for Bob Doobie Ridge.
Yes, well, Bob Doobie Ridge was the first battle the battalion was in. They'd walked for 2 or 3 days over Double Mountain and were completely exhausted. But the order was to immediately attack Bob Doobie Ridge, which was overlooking Salamoa, and the brigade's job was actually not to take Salamoa straight away, but to hold the Japanese forces in combat at Salamoa, because the next step was a sea landing at Lae, which was 80 to 100 miles further north up the coast, and to keep the bulk of the Japanese back at Salamoa. So the attack on that bridge, before we finally got it, took 72 days, and we lost 72 killed in that time. and probably double that in wounded, and double that again in sickness. So the casualties were very heavy there. But it features in a painting by Ivor Hill at the War Memorial, that particular episode, and it covers a big area of one wall, his depiction in paint of that battle where the 58th 59th Battalion are chasing the Japanese out of a area which had been knocked over by, all the trees had been knocked over by that stage with artillery. And one of the fellows from a section I was sent to used to be a very good rabbiter. He could shoot the eye out of a rabbit from about 100 yards, and he just sat up and he was picking off the Japanese as they were fleeing over 100 yards away. Old Geeker Wyatt.
To have taken 2 months and 12 days, it must have been pretty solid.
Yeah, well, going uphill, very steep hills, into well fortified positions, it's very difficult.
I guess really not unlike Gallipoli in that respect.
That's right. Gallipoli had a few occasions where the casualties were extremely difficult because of the physical conditions that they were working under. Yeah.
And of course the Japanese would have had a pretty good vantage point, wouldn't they?
Yes, and they could see what was happening, and they had reinforcements coming up from Salamoa. I don't know how many troops, but there's many tens of thousands of them. And a battalion in those days in Australia had between 600 and 650 troops. So obviously you didn't outnumber the Japanese, and they had a lot of artillery and good positions, but we had Air Force. Right. We had control of the air. But often, they couldn't pinpoint a pillbox from 1,000 feet high.
Did you get bombed on at one stage or something?
No, one of our New Zealand Air Force, we had New Zealand supporting us over in South Bougainville, planes called Corsairs, which were usually naval aircraft. They had a couple of, the New Zealanders had a couple of squadrons of these Corsairs used for close support to the infantry as they were moving. And they mistakenly started to fire too soon, and they got us instead of the Japs. Killed a couple of our fellas, and including the lieutenant who was our intelligence officer in charge of me. He got shot through the hips with a .5 bullet, went in one side and out the other. And he actually ran down the track for about 50, 100 yards just from the shock of it before he died. He had this gaping hole right through his body.
It seems a shame to me that the Bougainville theatre of the campaign is a largely overlooked one.
That's right. And it's interesting that the publicity or propaganda that came from our Supreme Commander, General MacArthur, he had a propaganda unit. If there was, for example, at Salamoa, there was, say, 20 different Australian units and one American unit, as there was, which didn't do very well, it was referred to as an Allied operation.
Right.
If it's all Australian, it was Australian, but they just needed the smallest participation in a unit, and suddenly, although it was 95% Australian, it became Allied.
Right.
And so the Yanks used to be looking for the glory all the time.
Yeah. It amazes me, I mean, you were supported by Matilda tanks, famous Australian tank. How did you go about helping your fellas getting these heavy tanks through very difficult, slippery jungle?
Well, you'd usually reconnoitre before you were going, if you're able to, see if a route was available to them. They were very, very useful, and it helped us a lot in our fighting with the Japanese. that they could, the Japanese bullets would bounce off them in most cases, the bullets, and overrun them. But the Japs had a surplus of heavy artillery in Bougainville. A 6-inch gun, for example, would be set up 50 yards off the side of a track, and they'd, knowing the tanks were going to come up along that track, and when it got to right angles with them, the tank would be in view of the 6-inch gun, which would fire, only need to fire one 6-inch shell, which was a very heavy shell, and that would demolish the tank. So on maybe half a dozen occasions, we lost tanks from this, and the Japs were quite happy to leave the 6-inch gun in that position and shoot off after they fired the one shell. Didn't have to, and the Australian troops would be surrounding reasonably close proximity to the tank, and of course when the shell burst, a lot of the Australians would be killed or wounded. Yeah.
You've mentioned to me once before in previous conversations about corduroying.
Yeah.
Now I think of corduroy pants.
Not
it wasn't
quite.
that.
Corduroying is a very old system of building a road through wet and boggy country. You cut trees down and then cut the trunks of the trees into about an 8-foot length, then split them and then lay them over the mud and anchor them in by driving bits and maybe even get 2 layers of this split timber over the mud so that the jeeps and then the tanks could
get some traction.
Yeah,
right.
Could go over.
And so
the poor old infantry, you'd do 2 days patrolling or whatever, and then the 3rd day was your rest day. But first you had to do, I think it was 2 yards of corduroying. So at daylight, you'd have a bit of breakfast, go into an area in the jungle where you knew it was reasonably safe to cut a tree down, and then cart the tree to the track, knock down a few banana palms and make plenty of room by both sides of the track, and then make it usable by the jeeps.
There seems to be this regard for Salvation Army blokes in the Second World War.
Yes.
What's that about?
Well, they were called comforts officers, and their job was not to fire rifles, but to provide coffee, biscuits and tea and writing materials to the troops. And each battalion had a comforts officer, and I forget our bloke's name, but he ended up being awarded a military medal. We thought he was a bit of a sook, we being the young soldiers, until there's a boxing tournament put on, and he went in and he thrashed everybody who came in the ring. Wow. So we looked up to him a bit after that. But
so he was up on the line?
Oh no, sometimes you'd be walking along a track, going along very slowly and looking around, wondering where the Japs were, and you'd turn the corner, and here was this comforts officer offering coffee as you walked along the track. Yeah. And the thing about them that I liked, they had an inexhaustible supply of condensed milk. Right. And you get hot coffee and condensed milk when you really needed it. And if you didn't have a cup, the tins of condensed milk he'd convert into mugs, and you could have a mug of coffee out of an empty condensed milk tin.
Did these fellas have a gun or a rifle?
No. So
they're in the jungle
unarmed.
They must have had.
They could throw a tin of condensed milk at them. That's about all.
So that's pretty brave, isn't it?
Yeah. No, it was very good for morale of the troops to have that sort of support. And of course they conducted church services. And we had also a Catholic padre, as they called them. He became a bishop of Canberra Goulburn eventually. Right. And it was very good that you had a source of to uplift you if your morale had dropped. Yeah.
You mentioned about the Matilda tanks. They were a source of shelter because you could hide behind them.
Yes, or underneath them at night time. You could dig in and get right underneath them if the shelling was going on.
And I believe that's really how you found out about the end of the war.
Yes, well, we had one Matilda with us in the final position I was in for the last couple of weeks of the war. It was very wet and miserable, not much action or no action really going on with the enemy. But we could get, they had very good wirelesses and we could pick up the ABC. And they'd, not loudly, but they'd, a bloke, the wireless operator in the tank would play the ABC news, and we knew when the atom bomb was dropped that way.
Right.
And the end of the war, we knew that.
So so you're sitting in the jungle, listening to a tank on the wireless. What did you think?
We didn't jump up and celebrate and throw confetti around. But as far as I remember, we just said, thank God for that.
So there was a sense of relief.
And then after a couple of days, I got shipped off in a Jeep to the hospital. I was pretty immobile. And the others went back. During the previous 3 months, somebody had the bright idea that they'd take money out of our pay, which was accumulating. We didn't have anything to spend it on. But the left out of battle segment of each battalion were back safely at Torquay. And the money they took from the soldiers' pay, they bought bottles of beer with. And they had to guard it very closely, and they had hundreds and hundreds of bottles of beer, and each soldier had paid for, let's say, a dozen bottles of beer. It was being kept in a store for when we came out of battle and went back to the base camp.
Right.
Me going to hospital meant that when I came out of the hospital, somebody had drunk my bottles of beer that I'd paid for. And I didn't ever get that good value for the £5 or whatever much it was had been deducted from my pay to buy this beer. But I didn't worry about that. I didn't drink in those days. But I could swap the bottles of beer for cigarettes. That's what I used it for.
So the war ends in August.
Yeah.
But you're not back in Sydney till when?
Yeah, so then the fighting units like 58, 59 were broken up. And the young troops were then sent to other battalions job was to collect the surrendered Japanese and send them back to Japan. So I went to a battalion called the 3151 Battalion, collected some surrendered Japanese from Nauru and Central Solomons, over to Rabaul, arrived there maybe November, and then we set up POW camps with about 15 or 20,000 Japanese in each one of these camps, waiting the transport back to Japan, and put the Japs to work under their own officers and sergeants, digging up and collecting and then dumping to sea thousands of tons of ammunition that they had stored. Rabaul was one of their main store areas. And then they were escorted or sailed back to Japan in usually captured Japanese vessels. There was an aircraft carrier, for example, which would steam out of Rabaul Harbour with thousands of Jap troops on the flight desk. How they survived with the rough sea, I don't know. But as far as I know, they all got back safely.
So when did you arrive back in Sydney?
Got back in, I think it was June or July 1946.
46.
And the story that I was going to tell you about the troop ship, but
That's nearly a year later.
Nearly a year later, yeah. Well, it took us a long while to gather up all the surrendered Japanese. Anyhow, all I can remember about arriving back in Sydney, the troop ship had about 3 or 4 levels, and about 4 o'clock in the morning, we're outside Sydney Head, and we're told to get all of our gear on, get out in the corridor and form a line ready to go off the ship when it docked. So we stood there for a couple of hours, and the ship docked at number 1 Circular Quay. And we're all lined up, say 1,000 troops up and down the corridors in the ship. And a message was passed back along the line. Watch it. The provos are searching everybody as you get off the ship. Don't take any souvenirs of swords and bayonets and revolvers that you're taking back as souvenirs. Oh, right. So as the first lot of trips, when it pulled up, you could hear the stuff being thrown in the harbour on the left.
Oh.
So there must be a huge pile of old weapons in number 1 circular quay.
Oh.
And then I wasn't going to throw my stuff out, and of course there were no provosts there. So somebody had started this vicious rumour, just as a joke.
Right.
And you imagine it passing down the line of soldiers standing and waiting to get off the ship. And everybody got a bit upset because of their valued souvenirs ended up at the bottom of the harbour.
So the ship came in where the ferries were?
Yeah, number 1, it used to be the International.
Oh, right, yes.
And parked there, and we filed off the ship, got in some buses and went to an army camp at Marrickville. And after the next day, I think I told you, I went on leave, they were given leave, and I went to the barber shop to get my hair washed.
Yes. So there was a demobbing process. How would you describe that?
Well, it took quite a while. From the 3151 Battalion, they selected me to take their battalion records and deliver it to somebody who should have got it down in Sydney. So I was carting this heavy wooden box as well as all my gear. And we went to Ingleburn, a military camp after Marrickville, and I handed over this box of records and then just sat and waited. Nobody seemed to know what to do with me, so then I got a message I had to go to Greta. No, I firstly came out here to, what's this camp down at Rooty Hill? It was an army camp.
Oh, the Light Horse.
Where the Light Horse. That was a big army camp there.
Right.
So I waited there for a few days. I knew well enough not to report into that I'd arrived, because if you reported in, you then had to come to all their parades. So I was just an anonymous soldier at that army camp.
Right. Yes.
And then when they found out I was there, I got a notice, you go to Greta up past Newcastle.
Oh.
And I got to Greta and immediately went to hospital with malaria. And I was in the hospital for 3 or 4 weeks with malaria at Greta. Then finally come down to Victoria Barracks and get my discharge.
So where did you catch up with your parents?
Well, there was a telegram service, because Mum's got a copy of a telegram that I sent saying that I'd be leaving Rabaul at such a time, and my brother was outside the wharf, and a few of my relatives from Sydney, and they waved at me as I went past in the bus from the ship. Then they followed me out in the taxi out to Marrickville, and I was reunited with. But Mum and Dad stayed. They were up at Mullumbimby at that time.
Right.
They didn't come down to welcome the returning soldier.
Right. So when did they give you your old job back at the Commonwealth Bank?
Yes, they were very good to they gave you leave, military leave, and if the military pay was less than your bank pay, they put the difference in your bank account. And for those days, I was quite wealthy with this bank account. I think I had £200 in it. Wow. Which was a lot of money when I was on £2, 4 and 6pence a week was my pay in the bank at the time. Mm. And it was a little more than the army pay. So I resumed the job with the Commonwealth Bank and went to Parramatta and then out to St Mary's to open a new branch out here.
Looking back at your war experience, what did you learn from the war that influenced your life from then on, do you think?
Well, I think being able to look after yourself, to feed yourself, to do your own washing, to generally keep looking around and assess the dangers. What are the odds of doing this? I've always been that way. What are the odds of, if you do take certain action, do you think it's a good decision one way or the other? And of course the friendships that you gain has lasted all of my life after that. Mm.
Yes, yeah. And you're still in touch with some of your...
Not too many left.
No.
Only one in Sydney that I know of, and the rest in New South Wales are gone. There may be a few in Victoria, but I've lost track of them. Yeah.
Because there are only about 3,000
There are 10,000 of the million who joined up in World War II. It's 1% left, yeah.
There's a poem that you read at a
Anzac Day too.
An Anzac Day service.
Yes. Where it is, mate, I don't know, but it's about missing soldiers. For example, World War II, there's still 20,000 bodies lying somewhere that haven't been properly buried. And this poem was about the missing soldiers, and it always stirs me up that their relatives, have no finality, not knowing what happened to the. In many cases, of course, they might have been shot down and burnt with their aeroplane, or blown up, and the fragments of their body are still under the ground somewhere. But missing, believed, killed was one of the categories of casualties.
Yeah.
And
yes.
I know in the recent Vietnam War there were 7 missing when the Australian troops finished with that, but they found all those bodies and brought them back to Australia.
Presumably they'll never find everybody.
No, it's too late now, I think. Although our battalion in France in 1916 suffered very severe casualties, and the Germans buried, I think it was about 180 of them from the 15th Brigade. The location of that grave wasn't known until about 10 years ago, when some historian from Melbourne eventually found it, and they dug the bodies up, identified them through, what's that system? DNA. They knew who they were, who the missing were, so they located the relatives 2 or 3 generations below the dead one, still living in Melbourne. They took those DNA from the relatives and extracted DNA from the bones of the people they dug up, and they were able to identify the skeletons and rebury them in a new cemetery in France. Yeah.
I sometimes think there's value in, in an older generation. Now you're 95. What advice could you give to younger people for the future, looking back on your life experience and war experience and so on?
Well, being an old banker, I'd say develop savings habits. Right. Very important. Savings habits. Don't spend too much of your pay. Put a bit aside for later. But also, in more general terms, young boys and girls, join something that trains you to be regimented, such as Scouts, Army Reserve, etc., church groups, and develop from that your association with your fellow citizens, work together as teams. That's about the best advice I could give.